Hey everybody, welcome to another multi-game My Thoughts On video, where I take a look at several different games that I don't really have all that much to say about individually, so I put them all into one video. In this particular case, I'm going to be taking a look at 5 different games, all beginning with the letter G, oddly enough. But we're going to be taking a look at Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, Grand Class Melee 2, Grappledrome, Grimoire Manastorm, and Guardians of Middle-earth. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at these things, and we're going to start with Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy. Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy was released last year, and its description is that it's a game that Bennett Foddy made for a certain kind of person to hurt them. No, really, that's exactly what it says on the Steam page. Regardless, what you have here is basically a time waster game. You are using kind of a physics-based movement system to move a guy who is stuck in a cauldron using a sledgehammer to propel himself forward until eventually you get to the top of the mountain and you get a supposed reward. Various features about the game on the Steam page include listen as he makes philosophical observations about the problem at hand, lose all your progress over and over, feel new types of frustration you didn't know you were capable of, and between 2 and infinite hours of agonizing gameplay, depending. The reality of the matter is this game exists purely to irritate you and waste your time. The controls are deliberately crap so that it makes it artificially difficult to climb the mountain, and when you finally do get up to the top, the supposed reward for getting that far is basically the game laughing in your face. It is one of the stupidest, most pointless games I have ever played in my life, and I cannot recommend it to anyone under any circumstances. Moving on. Next up is Grand Class Melee 2, which was developed by, I guess it's pronounced Agapagoid Entertainment, and was released in July of this year. It's the sequel to a game that was featured in the Independent Games Festival a few years ago, and it's basically a 4-person brawling game where you just all go into an arena and you fight it out until one of you's left standing, and the big difference with it compared to other games of its style is that you have a class system, and depending on what class you pick, you'll have different branching paths as to where your classes can go from there on out. So as you advance in the rounds, you get to advance your class and choose new abilities and that sort of thing, and find out how that works, and if it works well, then you generally succeed. If it doesn't work, then you fail miserably. And you basically try to win as many rounds as you possibly can. There are 3 modes of play, each featuring 8 rounds of combat with the class selection in between, and those are a basic versus mode, which is you and up to 3 other players just fighting it out in an arena, and it all has to be done locally. There is no online multiplayer in this game at all. And the other 2 modes are you versus 3 AI opponents in a complete free-for-all, or you versus 3 AI opponents all on the same team, so it's completely stacked against you at that point. I wasn't able to test the basic versus mode, so I can't confirm or deny whether or not the multiplayer itself is any fun, but both of the modes versus AI are a completely chaotic mess. It just ends up being a complete mess of everyone spamming abilities and attacks, and you can't really follow what's going on most of the time. And I imagine the multiplayer wouldn't be much different. Everybody's just spamming attacks and not really knowing what's going on most of the time. So I guess if you're at a party and everybody's slightly tipsy, then it might be a bit enjoyable, but it's not the kind of thing that's going to have any real lasting appeal, and I ultimately just can't bring myself to recommend it. Next up is Grappledrome, an arena shooter that is currently in early access, and the idea here is that you have one arm being kind of a grappling hook, and the other arm uses whatever weapon you have available to you. And the various arenas are built entirely around the fact that you're supposed to be constantly grappling and swinging around and trying to build up quite a bit of speed and momentum as you're trying to fight your opponents. And the idea is really cool, and I'd love to see how it works, except that literally nobody's playing it. I'm just going to go ahead and pop up a screenshot of the Steam charts stats for this thing to show you exactly what I mean. It's actually quite sad. The last developer update on Steam was in July, and they haven't put in the content they were working on at that point, so I'm not really sure what the future of this thing is going to be. As it stands, you have a multiplayer mode that is unplayable because there's nobody playing it, and the single-player mode consists entirely of time trials, and without really being able to test your skills in proper arenas, it makes it pretty difficult to actually do those time trials. So it's a real shame. I'd love to know how the grapple mechanics affect the gameplay, considering everybody can grapple and move around like that. But the simple and sad fact of the matter is, it's a dead game. So let's go ahead and move on. Next up is Grimoire Manastorm, a spell-slinging first-person shooter by OmniConnection that was put out in early access and released in full last year. In full disclosure, I was provided a review copy of this by the game's PR firm, although that was back when it was in early access, so I wanted to wait until the full game was out before I actually started judging anything. So here we are, the game's out in the wild. It is a free-to-play game, and the idea is that you have two classes rotating in and out every so often, and the classes are certainly available for purchase as well if you want to keep all of them permanently. It's primarily a multiplayer game with some offline play in the form of a survival mode that has both normal and hard difficulties, the hard difficulty being pretty ridiculous when you actually play because it just throws a ridiculous amount of enemies at you all at once. Of course, that just makes that mode irritating more than anything else, so if you play the single player, you'll probably end up sticking with the basic survival mode, because it's a decent way of learning how the various classes work and what the different spell combinations will do. But the real meat of the game is in the multiplayer component, and the idea there is that you have your spell loadout, which you can actually unlock new spells as you continue progressing through the game, because as you finish multiplayer matches, you'll get points that you can use to upgrade your various classes to give them more spell capabilities. But the problem with that is, you basically can't play this anymore, because basically nobody's playing it. This means that not only can you not upgrade your classes to get new spell capabilities, but the main meat of the game is effectively unplayable, which means the only thing you can do is play the extremely basic wave-based survival mode, and that loses steam extremely quickly. And it's a shame too, because even though the production values for the game are fairly low, as you can probably tell just by looking at it, the gameplay mechanics themselves, from what little I've been able to test anyway, seem pretty solid, and it seems like it could have been a really enjoyable game had they managed to actually retain a player base. But unfortunately, they weren't able to do that, and now the game is effectively unplayable unless you deliberately organize a bunch of players for it. And considering that, as far as I can tell anyway, the last developer update was last year, I don't really see this thing making a comeback anytime soon. In fact, if you look at the player stats for it, the peak amount of players was back when it was in early access, and it never really recovered from that. It's only gone down ever since, and when the game finally launched in its entirety, it still didn't get anywhere near what it got to during the very early access period. So it seems like even when the game launched out of early access into the full release, it was already on life support, and now it's basically flatlining. So while it is a shame, ultimately I hope the developers learn from this and move on to bigger and better things. So let's go ahead and move on to our final game for this video. The last game for this video is Guardians of Middle-earth. This is a MOBA developed by Monolith Productions and published by Warner Brothers in 2012 for consoles, which was PS3 and Xbox 360 at that time, and it was released the following year for PC, to a pretty mixed reception overall, particularly with regards to the PC version. Apparently there were a lot of interface problems with it, some of which are still in the game, but regardless, what are we dealing with here? Well, it was obviously a MOBA made to capitalize on the big craze for MOBAs around the time that it was released. So you had games like League of Legends, Dota 2, and of course Smite as well, all being very big names in the genre and attracting a huge amount of players and a huge amount of attention, and Warner Brothers thought they could capitalize on that by releasing a Lord of the Rings MOBA, which theoretically is not necessarily a bad idea. There's certainly a variety of characters in the Tolkien lore that will fit into the various roles that a MOBA requires, and from what I can tell, they've done a pretty decent job of setting all that up, but unfortunately, the game never really got off the ground, at least not on PC. It never attracted a very big player base, and it seemed to mainly be relying on the license to attract people to it, rather than the actual quality of the game. It's not to say that it's necessarily a bad MOBA. I'm not really a good judge of that because I don't like MOBAs. But in this particular case, it just seems like a pretty standard MOBA with nothing really to set it apart other than its license. And don't get me wrong, I'm a pretty big fan of Tolkien, but I don't like MOBAs. Smite is the only one that I've been able to get much of anything out of, and when I booted this thing up and messed around with it, I found that it was much the same as the other MOBAs I've tried out that weren't Smite, which in turn tells me if you like MOBAs, then you'd probably go into this thing and find that it's much the same as most other MOBAs out there, except that it has a price tag attached to it, and most of the other MOBAs that people are really interested in are free to play. And when you look at this compared to the big titans of the genre, like say League of Legends, Dota 2, Smite, or Heroes of the Storm, well, it doesn't stack up. It's really hard to beat free, especially when the only thing you're really bringing to the table is the theme. If they had done something really unique with the mechanics, it would be a completely different story, but instead, it's kind of obvious that this was made as a cash grab, and it ultimately failed. And even if you manage to get it in a bundle of games like I did, there really isn't much you can do with this thing because there's basically nobody playing it. The player base is in the single digits at this point, and you really cannot get a match going. So that basically leaves offline against bots, and the only thing you can do with that is play the practice mode, which only lets you play as Gandalf and is pathetically easy. Which is, of course, why all of the footage you're seeing here is me playing as Gandalf. I can't play as anyone else simply because I can't get a game going online, and the practice mode does not let me choose any other characters. So it's not even like I can really get a good assessment of the mechanics anyway, other than it just seems like most other MOBAs that I've played that I didn't like. So there's really nothing else I can say about it. There's obviously absolutely no reason for you to pick it up at this point, so just avoid it like the plague. And even if you do manage to get it as part of a bundle, all it's really going to do is take up space in your game library. So that's just a shame, really. So there you have it, folks. My thoughts on 5 different games, each beginning with the letter G, and 3 of which are completely dead as far as the multiplayer goes. And in those particular instances, that's a big problem with them because they're multiplayer games, and when a multiplayer game's player base is gone, well, there's not much you can do about it. But on the positive side of things, this makes a bit of a dent in the backlog, and that's always a good thing because the backlog has gotten utterly ridiculous at this point. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll catch you all in later videos.